Hello everyone. Today I want to show you DotVVM AMP, but first let me tell you what kind of problem this package will solve for you. In ideal world, we would want all our pages to be written in single technology. From simple presentation pages, which are mostly static and there is no need for communication back and forth from client to server, to our complex business pages, which contain a lot of dynamic data and there are a lot of actions which user can do, which are sent back and forth to the server and back. If we would choose just one for those very different scenarios, then we would sacrifice speed. On one hand, for simple presentation pages, we want to prioritize the load speed because those pages are usually the first thing user sees when he or she comes to our web application. For business pages, we prefer development speed in most cases because we don't care so much if page loads in 50 milliseconds versus 150 milliseconds. But we want such pages to be developed as quickly as possible. So it's probably no surprise that in a world where we would choose two separate technologies, we would choose DotVVM for the business pages. But the question about what to choose for simple presentation pages is more difficult to us. We could go with just plain HTML with small sprinkle of JavaScript to give it some basic functionality, or we can go with some lightweight web framework, but then our developers need to learn two separate frameworks and to maintain two separate code bases. One of such frameworks which I would highly suggest you to use is DotVVM AMP. AMP is all about the speed. So the first load of the page or any load of the page is really quick with AMP. Some averages is around 1 second for a page to be completely loaded, and in some special scenarios I will describe you later, there is nearly instant page load times. But if we want to achieve such low load times, there are some restrictions we need to obey. For example, there is no support for custom JavaScript. You won't be able to use your jQuery to move elements from places to places, or nearly any library is prohibited in AMP. There are some exceptions because AMP has its AMP script, but even those functionalities are really limited. Another big one is there is support for only inline CSS, and even with inline CSS there is size limit of just 75 kilobytes for most of your CSS. And something which will be really problematic if you are using third-party CSS libraries is that there is no important flag available. Most of those restrictions are in place for one reason, and that is that AMP needs to calculate where will the fourth of your screen be when you come to the page. So AMP wants to know which element to render if he wants to render only the first page, first part. But only those restrictions would not allow AMP to achieve those near instant load times. There are two main parts of AMP which allow it to be so fast. The first part is AMP framework. AMP framework is variant of HTML which adds some new elements and restricts usage of others. So for example, you cannot use your script in most scenarios because there is no JavaScript support, and you cannot use image, but there is an alternative AMP image tag for you. When you write your page in AMP, then it will already be pretty fast, but that's mainly because you are limited in terms of available functionality which you can use, and you will not achieve those near instant load times. In order to do so, you need to use the other part of AMP infrastructure. There is AMP cache, where your page gets when Google or other providers discover your AMP page. In order to get to those caches, your page needs to be valid. So if you break any of the rules given by AMP, your page will not be present in AMP caches. And when your page gets there, there is a whole bunch of optimizations. But caching isn't the only thing which is needed to provide those fast load times. The main part is AMP Viewer. You can imagine AMP Viewer to be just like a web application inside which your AMP application will be loaded. AMP Viewer is that part which will do the pre-rendering. You can imagine pre-rendering as AMP Viewer knowing where you want to go even before you clicked that link. So for example, if you are on Google search results, then that's AMP Viewer, and AMP Viewer will try to predict which page will you choose and load first visible part of the page before you even realize that you want to go there. So page is already loaded when you have clicked that link. That is what ensures those near instant load times. So let's say that we would want to use AMP for our simple pages. But now, what about the one technology problem? That's where DotVVM AMP comes in. DotVVM AMP allows you to have simple automatic conversions of .vm pages to AMP. The old .vm version will still exist, but alongside it there will be new AMP version of such page. Unfortunately, because .vvm uses AMP for this and AMP is restricted, there are some restrictions when you are using .vvm AMP. So pages which you want to convert have to be quite simple. For example, there is no support for any JavaScript, so the main .vm library, client library, will not be loaded, and thus there is no support for postbacks. Any communication which you want to do with the server needs to come as GET requests, when you will be provided new version of the page. Also, the CSS limitation is still applied, but you no longer need to combine all your scripts into one inline element. .vm AMP does this for you. Okay, you probably think, okay, I have few simple pages which could benefit from speed of AMP, but there's that one element which prohibits me of using .vm AMP. Fortunately, there are ways how you can annotate your page to display some elements only on AMP version or only on normal version. So you can wrap your one button which calls server with .vvm element AMP exclude, and then this element will not be present on AMP version of your page. If you don't want to go through your pages one by one and annotate your page, .vm AMP can be set in a way where it will just lock and ignore all invalid elements. In default settings, the exception is thrown as soon as invalid element or attribute is discovered, but in this setting it will be just locked and the page will be rendered without given element. This behavior can be configured for only some types of errors. For example, you can configure DotVVM AMP to throw away all important tags when you turn on lock and ignore for just CSS transformations or just for attributes and so on. Okay, let's try to integrate DotVVM AMP into an existing application. For this demo, I've prepared simple application with 3 different pages. First one is the kind of page you would want to transfer into AMP without any modifications. It has just some navigation which is shared across all the pages via the master page, and some basic content like image, some HTML literal, and 3 elements from repeater. Second page is opposite of the first one. It is kind of page you would want to emit from AMP translations. Yeah, it's kind of complex page with some selection and some server-side action. And we would want to disable the AMP transformation on this page. And lastly, we have kind of simple page which has one really complicated element on it. For this kind of page, we may want to hide this button, and replace it with some alternative text or something. In order to enable DotVVM AMP in our application, we firstly need to install DotVVM AMP NuGet package. Then it's just a matter of enabling DotVVM AMP in configuration in our startup. Firstly by calling add DotVVM AMP on configuration instance, and then on DotVVM service collection. Here you can specify some additional configurations. For example, you can specify before mentioned error handling modes. So for example, you can disable error exception throwing in situations where invalid HTML tag is detected. You can instead just log this error and ignore such element. But for now we will leave it in default configuration. You can also add your own custom control transformations. Control transformations allow you to create some support for currently not supported AMP controls, such as AMP carousel. You just need to create some transformation rules and your AMP carousel control and register it in AMP control transforms registry. There are many other options you can choose from, ranging from some handling of unsupported cases to custom route patterns. Let us leave it in default options for now. And this is everything you need to do to enable AMP support. Now you only need to choose which pages will be transformed into AMP and which will be left with just DotVVM version of it. So here we have our 3 pages. We have the simple one where we want DotVVM AMP support. We have our complex page where we want to stick with just DotVVM version, and we have our complex element page where we want to emit part of the page. To enable DotVVM AMP support, you just need to replace add with AMP and add DotVVM configuration instance as last parameter. In case that you need to specify something like alternative default values for your parameters URL, this is also possible via this method. If we go into our application now, we can see that not a lot has changed. Yeah, the application still looks the same, but now we have this icon which indicates that there is valid AMP version available. but the version looks nearly the same as the original version of the page. The navigation still works. If you want to go to page which does not have AMP support, you will be redirected to normal .vm version of it. But if you want to go to page which has AMP support, you will go from one AMP page to another. Here you can see that the application returned error 500 because this page contains some unsupported element. In this case, it's the button which calls server, which is not enabled in AMP. It cannot work here. So we would need to modify this page in order for it to work properly. This can be done in multiple ways. First, we can be lazy and just disable the error throwing for this option, which can be done in the custom configuration for AMP. So this is what I will try first, and I will disable all error handlings, or just set them to lock and ignore. So styles, attributes, knockout, and that should be plenty for this page. If we go back and reload the page, now we see that the page works even when it's AMP version, but the one crucial element is missing now. If we are fine with this, this is all we need to go do. But in case we want not just to omit the problematic element, but we want to replace it with something else, we can do it by some annotations. So I will delete this configuration because I want my application to throw exception when something is not correct. And I will annotate the complex element page in order to hide this problematic section. This can be done by AMP exclude. Everything which is inside this element will not be rendered on AMP version. This element has its alternative for the other operation, which is AMP include. Everything which is inside this element will be rendered only in the .vm version and not on AMP. So you can have this simple OR, one content for AMP, one content for .vm. Okay, so we will put some text here. Okay, now when we run our application, we can see that the button was replaced by our message, and on the old .vm version there is the button back, and it still works as we would expect. So how does it work under the hood? It extends the classical .vm view building. So at the beginning of each request you just load your .html, you build your control tree from it, and in normal .vm you would now just send it to the server with all knockout bindings and so on. In AMP version there are some additional operations done here. Firstly, we apply the AMP transformations. So we take all rules which, for example, replace one control for another. So if we see that you are using HTML generic control with tag image, so HTML tag image, we will replace it with our AMP image control. Yeah, you have some additional operations which are done. For example, we set server rendering to enabled for all your bindings. So now everything which would be rendered via knockout on client is rendered on server. Then we are doing some transformation of CSS. First, we take all required CSS files and resources on your page, we merge them together, we parse it in order to remove any forgotten important text if the .vm AMP is configured to do so. We are doing some validation, and because we still need to fit in those 75 kilobyte restriction, that's why we are doing some additional optimization and minification. So in the end you are left with two inline elements. One is for your classical CSS, which has that 75 kilobyte limit, and the other one is for all your animations, where the size limit is also present, but it's much higher. And from this point on, it's again simple .vvm page, so everything is rendered on server and sent to client. And that is everything that is to .vm transformations. So in order to use it, you just add .vm AMP NuGet package, you modify .vm startup by adding those two methods, one on .vm configuration and one on service collection instance. And from this point on, you just select which pages you want to have the AMP version with, and which will be left with just the normal .vm version. After this initial configuration, I would highly suggest to go to your application and see where something is broken and annotate it with AMP include or AMP exclude. And that's it. Now you have your two versions for certain pages, and Google and other search engines should give you few more SEO points for this. Okay, this is everything from me today. You can find the demo at this GitHub page, and this is the link for the NuGet package. If you have any questions, just write them in the chat and I will respond to you. Okay, have a nice day everyone, bye.